Chapter 17. Holy Mount Boromise stood amid the jungles reportedly inhabited by Viera, where no human dared tread, but although the rabbit race forbade the presence of humans on their lands, they had no objection to the use of airships to fly over their land, nor did they disturb the two pathways that led to the mountainside by means of the outer edge of the jungle, and thus the mountain had long been populated by humans. It had been said that once in a great while a group of Viera would ascend the mountain to speak and trade with the humans there, always peacefully, but maintained their own borders with far more violence than most would consider due. Boromise thus proved to be a truly neutral territory, if even the vicious Viera regarded it as sacred, and Ashalia hoped with all earnestness that some agreement could be reached there. She could tell that Bosch mirrored this hope, though she seemed to have effectively trained him to remain silent, something she had never quite been able to accomplish with Azelas. Vaughn's interest in the plan appeared somewhat opposing, however, for he, too, kept his mouth shut about the conference, clearly having nothing nice to say about it. While he more or less admired Monty, he still had no love for the Empire, not that Ash blamed him. Penelo remained in the cabin, keeping watch over the little prince, for although his fever had broken easily, his perilous travels had exhausted him, and he had not yet woken from the deep slumber that he had cried himself into at the Gareth village. She, like the pirates, appeared quite neutral towards the events that were to take place, which the princess took some comfort in. Ash herself stood at the back of the cockpit, deep in thought. It had indeed shocked her to see Bolthir care so tenderly for a child, but it shocked her more to realize how greatly his countenance resembled Monty's. The boy had appeared practically heartless as he delivered the news of his father's death, careless, even, but once he escaped all judging eyes, he broke down perhaps even faster than could be considered normal. She wondered if Bolthir was like this, if he was only strong for the sake of others. She herself had been in such a position for much of her life. The people needed her, they depended on her for hope and perseverance, her father had often told her this. For Lamont to face such trials at his age, she hardly expected him to understand the importance of bravado, but he certainly did, and looking back on Bolthir's interference, it seemed that he did, too. Ash knew, though, that it was a learned skill. Monty gave in fast, as was expected of him, but never had she seen Bolthir lose control, and that could mean only one thing: he'd had many years of practice. Even looking at him now, it became more and more evident that he hid within him a great deal of pain. True, to any other he would seem perfectly content, sitting at the controls, cracking jokes with Fran, but she had seen the look in his eyes that night in the hut as he tucked Monty's head beneath his chin. He was hiding something. He had been discomforted by the crying child as many would be, but his greatest fear that night had been buckling with him, revealing his own emotions, facing whatever tormented him. But Ash did not know how to investigate this, nor was she entirely sure that she wanted to know the truth, and thus she simply sat beside Bosch and listened in as the pirates gave Vaughn flying lessons, which did a good deal to lighten her mood. When Lamont finally awoke, it was from a nightmare. He had sat straight up with a gasp, but seemed to realize quickly enough that he was in no real danger and flopped back down, laying his arm over his eyes and exhaling deeply.
"Are you all right?"
Penelo had asked.
"I think so. Where are we?" "Bolthir's ship. I think we're about halfway there."
He turned to her with a look of mild confusion.
"There. Mount Boromise. Remember?"
She felt somewhat let down when he didn't smile, but the glint of unfettered surprise that overcame his expression soon quelled this. The simple fact that he had put into motion a plan of fixing things refreshed his hope, and almost instantly the gravity of the situation seemed to lessen, though Penelo knew that danger still loomed over them at every turn. It quickly became clear, however, that he didn't like to worry people, didn't like to be doted on. But she had insisted on feeling his forehead, and then ordered him to down a glass of water. He protested that he no longer felt sick, but she was not one to be argued with, and he eventually gave in. Then, of course, she demanded that he eat something, assuring him that it would make him feel better and that it was her last order. Given that she had promised her previous order would be the last, he refused, claiming he wasn't hungry, and didn't relent until she agreed to eat with him. Sure enough, it put him in better spirits, and sure enough, it was not her last order. Next she told him to go back to sleep, but he wasn't tired, so he said, and he wasn't ill, and he was perfectly capable of taking care of himself, thank you. Needless to say, the prince had grown quite skilled in hiding his true emotions, but when Penelo finally asked him if he just wanted to be left alone, he grabbed her arm with a frantic look of terror in his eyes and told her no. So, she climbed up onto the bunk beside him and they sat side by side against the back wall with the sheet over their heads like children, which they were. She had been unsure of the propriety in asking him about his family, but in the end, she didn't have to. He asked about hers, what they were like, what she did when her parents died, how old she had been, and she related her experiences as best she could without bursting into tears. He seemed particularly saddened by her description of Rex, likely because he felt somewhat responsible for his death, but she thought nothing of it. War was war, after all, there was nothing he could have done. For the most part, she managed to restrain her tears, but her voice cracked at one point, and she had to take in a shaky breath to continue, and she probably would have indeed cried had Monty not scooted closer and snuggled up under her arm. He himself had a similar experience when telling her about his mother.
After Vane's mother died, father could never sleep, so he'd stay up all night pacing around the palace. My mother, she was an orphan, but her father was a judge, so after he died, I don't know. I guess it was guilt. Her job was to scrub the floors at night, so she wouldn't be in anybody's way. That's how they met. He used to tell me all the time that I have her eyes. She was only 18 when I was born. Drace said she died holding me. She said she was smiling.
Unable to bear seeing him cry again, Penelo had carefully taken his hand in hers. It proved more than enough to settle him, though she was prepared to shift to her side and hug him should the need arise. He told her about his early years, how they were spent at constant victory parties under the alias of a distant cousin of the Solidars, where every noble lady would pet and kiss and fawn over him, and Vane would allow him a few sips of champagne, and he would wake the next afternoon with only fleeting memories of the previous night. By the time he turned 2, he had sat through enough high court cases to pick up the terminology, and would often shout out "Objection!" at random, only to have his father or brother reply "Overruled." Vane taught him to fence, and Drace taught him to read. Gabranth taught him to curse in Landesian. His interest in science started young, urged on by Dr. Sid and his wife, the palace garden keeper, whom Monty described as a gentler version of Drace, more interested in having fun than obeying rules, and always eager to teach him some new escape tactic, as she was intimately familiar with the palace grounds and knew the intricacies of every dark corner and secret passageway. Likewise, Sid seemed to embody all the less dignified aspects of Vane and Gabranth, assuring Monty that rules could bend quite a long way before breaking, and that as long as something good was discovered at the end, the means were always more than justified. Monty, it seemed, was living proof that it took a village to raise a child, even a royal prince. but he nevertheless displayed the usual signs of childhood occasionally, and recently appeared to have become far less interested in fitting in among adults, though Penelo could not tell if this was because he had seen what they were capable of and shunned it, or because he simply couldn't handle the stress that had been so quickly and so brutally heaped upon him all at once. A small light of joy had returned to his expression, but when she mentioned the others in the cockpit, he seemed to once again withdraw, and would likely have freed himself from her arm had she continued. Noting this discomfort, she slid the backs of her fingers delicately over his baby-fine hair and let them trail down his cheek deftly until he took hold of her hand and pressed his face into her palm. Glancing down at him, she found his eyes closed peacefully, and then felt a small tremor go through his spine and quickly pass to hers.
"Ready to go out and see everyone?"
she asked quietly.
"Not yet,"
he whispered. His left arm carefully snaked behind her while his right passed over her stomach to encircle her waist. Eyes still closed, he nuzzled his head against her chin and let it rest on her collarbone, and she tightened her protective hold on his shoulders, letting her hand remain where he had placed it, softly caressing his face.
"You're still my hero, you know?"
she said. He smiled, and she rested her head on his. Out in the cockpit, Vaughn had relinquished control of the straw to Bolthier after nearly nose-diving into a wooded hill, and in the subsequent calm the ship adopted in the hands of her captain, the princess had drifted off to sleep. Fran had begun to show Vaughn the navigation system, though his curiosity and admittedly short attention span made it slow going. Before long, faint frequencies sounded on the interceptors, soon revealing themselves as Arcadian in origin and military in nature, much to Vaughn's nervousness. However, they appeared relatively far off, near the summit of the mountain, whose base they had yet to reach, so panic proved yet unnecessary. But Bolthier knew better than to further irritate Ashalia, and thus decided he'd better give her fair warning of the new development.
"Princess!"
Receiving no answer, he turned to see that Ash slept serenely against Bosch's side, her head resting on his shoulder and her hair hanging slightly over her eyes. Bosch appeared rather uneasy about this, but he obviously didn't know how to politely wake her. Bolthier just rolled his eyes, muttering something along the lines of "lucky bastard," and switched on the ship's intercom.
"Princess!"
At this, she leapt from her seat with a start, her hand already at the hilt of her sword before she realized she had no real cause for alarm. She leveled a glare on Bolthier, who smiled in return.
"Good morning,"
he mused.
"Do you have a death wish?"
she shot back. Vaughn turned away to hide his muffled laughter from her.
"I might,"
Bolthier answered.
"We're picking up Imperial frequencies. They've probably put up more checkpoints to find Monty." "On neutral territory?"
Ash asked.
"Neutrality makes it that much easier,"
he explained. She shook her head.
"You can get us through, can't you?" "Well, you got through one before." "To be honest, Princess, I'm not so worried about us." "Oh. Hey."
Vaughn stepped in.
"If we can get through, I'm pretty sure a Rosarian can. We're just pirates, after all." "Just pirates?"
Bolthier scoffed.
"I suppose a Rosarian would jump at the chance to make Arcadia look bad,"
Ash added.
"Occupying neutral territory,"
Bosch replied.
"It almost seems too easy. But it could trigger more trouble than we're prepared for."
Ash nodded contemplatively.
True. On the other hand,
said Bolthir,
we're dealing with a prince, not the emperor. He might not be willing to piss off his old man. We should wait for him anyway,
said the princess.
We'll lose nothing if he doesn't show, and if push comes to shove, Vane will receive no less than his due for imposing on neutral ground. If you say so,
Bolthir conceded. The door to the hallway opened with a squeak, and they all turned to the back of the cockpit, finding Penelo there alone.
Hey, everyone,
she said casually.
How is he?
Asked Ash, more quickly than she had intended.
Not great,
said Penelo,
but I think he's getting better.
Bolthir smirked.
I think you're going to make a fine empress one day. Oh, quit being gross.
Penelo squealed.
Give it about 5 or 6 years,
Bolthir insisted.
Then see how gross it is. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Vaughn injected.
I'll knock the kid's block off.
Penelo giggled.
You wouldn't stand a chance. She's right, you know.
Fran added.
If they really wanted to bring down Rosaria,
said Bosch,
they'd throw Monty on the battlefield and let him have his way. I'd pay to see that,
Bolthir confirmed.
Seems like a sound plan to me,
said Ash.
He's definitely his father's son.
Penelo grimaced.
Oh, don't say it like that. Relax,
Bolthir assured her.
He'd have to be in exceptional form to work over Emperor Margrace. Not all royals are pushovers like Princess Ash here. You've been in exceptional form yourself as of late,
the princess retorted.
Assisting us without payment, looking after the prince, hardly your nature. I'll get my payment eventually,
Bolthir replied.
And the last thing I want is for Vane to come under the impression that I'm responsible for any ill happenings that may befall the brat. You don't have to worry about me, although I can't say I'm unaccustomed to people doubting my intentions.
Ash rolled her eyes.
We've all grown immune to your double talk, Bolthir. Oh, have you now? I've screwed you over before payment-wise, and you'd have been safer to leave Lamont with us. Now, you're a welcome hand and a great aid, but you've yet to explain why. I'm only here to see how the story ends, any self-respecting leading man would do the same.
Seeing the deadpan doubt on her face and the clear amusement that the others so poorly hid, he dropped his smirk and thickened his sarcasm.
Shall I swear by your sword or some such?
Luckily, Monty entered the cockpit at that moment, at first relieving the atmosphere, but then suddenly weighing it down once more, for they all knew that there could be no explicit mention of his breakdown. He would not be able to maintain his dignity among adults if he knew that they had seen him cry, that they had seen him act his age for once.
Hey!
said Vaughn.
He's alive. More or less,
Monty replied with a shrug.
How are you feeling?
asked Fran. He smiled sweetly, though somewhat forcefully.
Much better, thank you.
And then he turned to Ash, and his expression seemed overwrought with guilt, though the more likely explanation was simple shyness.
Your Highness,
he said quietly, drawing her attention more by his tone than by his address.
I just wanted to apologize. I wasn't much of a gentleman back there. I wouldn't have listened if you had been,
she replied with a nod, turning to the wide window of the cockpit to resist smiling.
We should reach Baromise by noon. We'll see if your Rosarian friend shows. The 13th prince, hey.
Balthier mused.
Wouldn't that be Almid? Yes, unfortunately,
said Monty.
Should I have heard of him?
Asked Ash.
Well,
Balthier answered upon seeing Monty's hesitance,
he caused a bit of trouble last year, drag racing imperial ships with his cousins, or something. Perfect,
Ash groaned.
Don't worry,
Monty insisted.
He's known for his open-mindedness.
Balthier rolled his eyes.
That's not all he's known for. Meaning?
Asked Monty.
Maybe when you're older.
The boy gave him a mischievous smirk.
Worried about your princess? My princess?
The pirate scoffed half-threateningly.
What's there to worry about?
Asked Ash.
Nothing.
Balthier growled.
Everything is going to be fine. Unless you fly us through the lab,
said Monty.
Hey, that was a long time ago. I still can't believe the Strahl made it out of there in one piece. It's a miracle you're still standing. You think you could do better? There's only one way to find out. Don't get your hopes up. Let him try it,
Vaughn injected.
You let me. You let Vaughn fly your ship?
Penelo asked.
Are you trying to get us all killed? Hey!
Vaughn smacked her arm, and she promptly struck back, initiating yet another of their childish tussles.
Trust issues?
Ashalia asked.
Logic issues,
Balthier corrected.
Or are you just worried that he'll be better at it than you are?
Bosch added.
Damn it!
Balthier groaned, rising out of the pilot's seat and shoving Monty into it.
All right, kid. If you put a scratch on my baby... Calm down,
Monty said tiredly.
I know what I'm doing.
Balthier shook his head.
I've heard that before.
Monty smiled.
Okay, I mean it this time.
The others looked on in bemused wonder as the boy kept the ship steady, even amid Balthier's nervous flurry of instructions and warnings. Monty's inexperience did show, but he proved more apt at piloting than Vaughn, and Balthier seemed to calm a bit as he realized this, though he remained wary for the sake of his ship.
You've done a lot of work on her,
Monty noted after a moment.
Of course I have.
Balthier replied.
I banged half the life out of her in Arcades, and that pathetic little engine could barely get her off the ground. It isn't really Nethysite, is it? No,
he admitted,
just regular Magicite. We did try, but there were deadlines and all.
Balthier subtly grimaced at this.
And he thought your father wouldn't find out. He didn't, did he?
Monty replied with a rather peeved tone of arrogance.
Thanks to my work of genius,
the pirate corrected.
Forgive me for not being grateful. Forgive me for not expecting it. How'd the old bastard get this thing moving, then? Not even Fran can figure it out. He magnetized a piece of magicite and broke it in half,
Monty explained matter-of-factly,
so each piece alternately transfers its energy to the other until they're separated.
Balthier raised an eyebrow.
Magicite that behaves like Nethysite. Something like that,
Monty confirmed with a nod.
The energy can only go between the rocks, though. It can't be discharged. He's tried. I bet he has,
Balthier groaned.
I suppose you'll be wanting it back now. No, you can keep it.
At this the pirate appeared to adopt an openly suspicious countenance, though he seemed to harbor no ill to it. Monty caught on quickly, though, and continued.
If I wanted it back, I could have just pulled in a favor from Redas.
Balthier blinked.
Oh. It's not much use anymore,
Monty went on.
Sid came up with the Nethysite model right after you disappeared. So much for throwing a wrench in his gears,
Balthier muttered.
Sorry to have to tell you this,
said Monty,
but it didn't matter anyway. He used your genetic magicite model to create artificial Nethysite. Without your research, we wouldn't even be able to understand it, much less manufacture it. We also wouldn't be in this whole mess, would we?
He replied, crossing his arms indignantly.
All my research ever did was give Dr. Sid a 30-second high on his own pride.
Monty briefly looked up at him, but knew better than to take his eyes off the horizon and immediately got back on track.
Don't be so hard on him, he has his moments, but he's a scientific genius. Oh,
Balthier scoffed,
is that why he's always talking to himself? He doesn't talk to himself,
Monty shot back,
he talks to Vina. And just who is Vina? Well, the name he's given to the voice in his head, I suppose. Oh, well, then I supposed I had better.
Balthier trailed off slowly, his eyes growing as they focused on some sight of apparent interest in the distance.
Whoa!
He said quietly.
That's more than just a security check.
Monty's eyes widened as he looked upon the same sight, and the others stood and gathered in around the window in shock. The summit of the great mountain now stood within distant view, but swarming around like a choking haze of fog was a full fleet of Arcadian ships. Many appeared to have landed in the nearby peaks of the lesser mountains that stood in the range, and by the looks of the settlements they had erected there, it appeared that they had the means to stay for quite some time. None, however, dared land at Boromyces itself, for that particular mountain remained known worldwide as a politically neutral shelter to refugees, and to occupy it even peacefully would warrant outrage from every corner of Ivalice. The jungles at the base of the mountain range, too, remained untouched, for it was there that the Viera resided, unwelcoming of humans. Only 2 land paths led to the summit without trespassing on Viera territory, and the Imperials had quartered off both of them.
Oh, no?
Monty whimpered dazedly.
Looks like Vane's a little worried about you,
Balthier replied.
I thought Boromyces was neutral,
Penella whimpered.
So did I,
replied Monty, rising from the pilot's seat so that Balthier could steer the straw into hiding.
I don't suppose Arcadia's known for playing by the rules, hey? What?
Asked Balthier.
You really didn't see this coming?
Ash shoved his shoulder harshly.
Will Almid be willing to risk all of this?
She asked.
I don't know,
said Monty.
I'm sure Sid would give him fair warning. Well, what do your majesties want to do now?
Balthier groaned. Monty looked to Ash sheepishly.
The Grand Kiltias will still hear you. How do you propose I reach him?
She retorted.
If you hand me over, they might leave.
The boy suggested with a shrug.
Might?
Asked Ash. With the ship safely hidden, Balthier leaned back and sighed irritably.
Nothing personal, Monty,
he said in an oddly casual tone,
but we can't be sure of exactly which judges we're dealing with here. You can talk down Gabranth and Drace easily enough, and I can handle Zargiboth, but Bergen will take no quarter from either of us, and for all we know, Vane himself could be up there.
Monty's eyes dimmed slightly as he pressed himself to think harder, but the grimness of the situation settled on his face with unmistakable weight, and Fran at last intervened.
We could walk,
she said slowly.
Through the Galmore jungle?
Asked Ash. Fran nodded.
I could lead us.
An uncertain silence fell over the ship, but Balthier seemed oblivious to it.
Where do we land?
He asked.
Near the coast,
said Fran.
East of the mountain.
He maneuvered the ship carefully amid the low hills, guiding it toward the ocean and away from the Empire's gaze.
Hope you're all ready for a hike.
Lamont smiled then, and it was as if the world had begun anew.